Hey everyone, welcome back to Miniature Painting 101, a series of videos where I teach you all about painting miniatures from start to finish, from preparation to painting, and today is going to be about preparation. So specifically today is going to be part 79, painting before assembly, how to paint your models before assembling them, and some pros and cons and how to do it in a more efficient manner. So the pros are that you get a lot better access to your models since there's nothing blocking any part. And a second pro of painting before assembly is that usually less masking is involved because you can separate the parts that require different techniques, such as dry brushing or airbrushing specifically, so you don't need to mask the other areas. The downside is, if done improperly, it can lead to very weak bonds between the pieces, since if you don't glue the actual parts together and you just glue paint part to paint part, the bond is actually between paint and it's very thin. And it can take longer as well if done inefficiently. Because you have to paint a lot of parts separately instead of one giant model. So the key is to make sure that the pieces are actually touching when you glue them together and not paint part over painted part, because then it's just the paint that's glued together. So the first step when painting before assembling is removing it from the sprue correctly. So if you have a nice plastic model like this, this is a Necron Overlord. The key is to use the sprue to your advantage. Use pieces of the sprue so that you can be able to hold the pieces if you decide to paint that part separate from the rest. And since this connection part won't have any primer connected, I always recommend doing it at the bottom of the piece. That way it's very easy to hide, so later on you can just paint on a little primer and cover it up pretty easily. So the key is to use pieces of the sprue when removing it from the sprue, as you can see like here. So that way, as I said, you can hold the piece in your hand without touching the piece if you decide that piece will be painted separate from the rest. Another big key when painting before assembly is don't paint all the pieces separate and then glue them on together. There is an easy way to think about this method. Basically, start with the core of the body and then look at what pieces actually prevent or block the painting of other pieces. For example, in this guy, the cape will be blocking the entire backside of the Overlord. But the chest, however, as you can see the chest here, doesn't block anything. So by gluing the front of the chest on, it doesn't block the painting of any part. So you can easily glue that part on ahead of time before priming and it'll go perfectly. You don't need to actually paint the chest separate from the body. However, the weapon here, you might want to use an airbrush on. So if you want to mask the entire body off, you may want to keep that arm separate. Plus, as I said, the cape will block the entire backside of the miniature, and as will that other part of the skeleton. So you may want to paint those parts separately. But that leg right there, the leg will go on easily and will not block any part of the miniature, so you can easily glue that part on ahead of time. And by doing this process and just looking at which parts actually block other pieces, you can get the majority of the body together, such as this. Now, as you can see, the arms on, the head's on, and the body's close together. Only the pieces that require either airbrushing and that you don't want to mask off, or that block off the other pieces, are going to be painted separately. This is the most efficient way of painting before assembly, because now you have a core body part that you have 100% access to over the entire model, but at the same time you can paint the cloak separate and the side separate and that back skeleton part separately as well. So as you can see, we can paint this entire model and then put the pieces together afterwards. The next important part is you've got to make sure, especially with plastic miniatures, it becomes increasingly important, but you want the pieces to be exposed at the connection points. So there's a few ways of accomplishing this. The first way is to mask it using either putty or tape or something to mask off just the points of connection. That way you don't put any primer on them, and most importantly, you don't put any paint on them. And that way, when you connect the pieces, it's actually the pieces of the miniature connecting to each other. I personally, when doing this, I use blue stuff, half of green stuff, the blue component. It's not very sticky, and I like to take some blue stuff and put it on all the parts that are going to be connected to other parts later. That way, when I prime over it, I can just remove the blue putty afterwards, or paint over it and then I can remove the blue putty afterwards. And that way the plastic is still exposed, and that way when you glue the two pieces of plastic together, or if you're doing metal or resin, same thing, you get the strongest bond possible because you're actually gluing the pieces together and not a thin layer of glue. A thin layer of paint. You don't want the thin layer of paint to be glued together. That way it becomes very brittle. So now that it's masked off, I can prime it as normal. And I'm just using an airbrush quickly to get some nice black primer over the entire model. And I can prime all the pieces separately since I have the pieces of sprue. I can hold them and easily hold them without having to touch the model itself. And I can prime evenly across all the pieces. And then simply when the primer is dry, I can just take a little pin or something and remove the blue stuff from all these connection pieces, and it will leave those parts exposed. And then the key is just to remember them. You can also paint over them if you want and remove it after. But the key is just to remember where they are and leave those parts exposed so that, as I said before, that now you can connect them properly and they still have a strong bond. That is the main downside to painting before gluing, but if done properly, you can still maintain a strong bond and you get complete access to the model, so you can paint over the entire miniature and no parts are left unpainted. So now I'm just going to scratch off the part of blue stuff from the hand with the scythe. And once again, as you can see, it's going to be exposed, and that's what we want to do, as I said. So that way there's no primer on these pieces, and it's just going to be the strongest bond possible. And as I said, you can do this after priming or after painting. It's easier. I prefer after priming, because that way it prevents the paint from hardening on top of the blue stuff. But you can just do this after painting, as long as you paint quickly, and then remove it afterwards. And here's just the back part of the skeleton. As you can see now, it's completely exposed, the connection piece as well, by removing the blue stuff. And now we can go ahead and paint all these pieces. So I'm going to use an airbrush and just quickly spray the cape. Now the key is also when painting before assembly is to remember that parts facing inwards that will be covered, leave them darker than the parts facing outwards. So the inside of this cape, for example, which would be facing the body, if I was painting it in its entirety, I would leave the inside darker than the outside, because then it creates a realistic shading on the pieces. You don't want to paint everything the same brightness, because the models everywhere facing outward would be brighter than the areas being cloaked by the rest of the model. So we'll just keep painting up this model. I'm not going to paint it to its entirety because I'm just doing an example, but just paint as much as you want, and yeah, now you can have access to the entire part, leaving the parts, the connection points exposed. And once again, I'll be painting the back skeleton part, leaving the connection exposed and not painted at all. That way it's going to be plastic versus plastic, and I can use plastic glue, which is a huge benefit for plastic miniatures. And the key is when gluing, the final hint is use minimal amounts of glue. Make sure it covers the point, but not too much. The problem is plastic glue will eat through the paint around it, and super glue will leave a white, chalky kind of residue in the out parts of the connection. So the key is to use minimal amounts of glue, and just use the bare minimum amount possible to connect the two pieces. That way you get a strong bond, but it doesn't go to the painted area around the connection point and either eat through the paint or leave residue. And that's it. That is how to paint before assembly. As I said, the key is to remove it from the sprue correctly. Think about which areas actually obscure the view from other model parts and paint those separately, or the ones that require different techniques such as airbrushing, and paint those separately. Mask off, or the other option is just scratching off the paint afterwards with an X-Acto knife and to expose the plastic beforehand. And then finally paint it, and then use minimal amounts of glue. So thank you as always for watching this episode of Miniature Painting 101, And stay tuned for part 80, which is just around the corner next week as always. But if you don't want to wait for next week, check out The Warp. Click on the link below for a free 14-day trial to my premium YouTube channel, where not only we get to see the next 6 months worth of Miniature Painting 101 episodes, you get to see over 60 start to finish painting tutorials, dozens of battle reports, some Airbrush 101 series, face-off episodes, just some awesome wargaming content. So go ahead and check out The Warp. I think you'll love it. So thank you very much as always for watching. Until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting everyone.